Sports car racing is a form of circuit auto racing with sports cars that have two seats and enclosed wheels. They may be purpose-built or related to road-going models, a type of hybrid between the purism of open-wheelers and the familiarity of touring car racing. This style is often associated with the annual Le Mans 24 hours endurance race. First run in 1923, Le Mans is one of the oldest motor races still in existence. Other classic but now defunct sports car races include the Italian classics, the Targa Florio and Mille Miglia, and a Mexican Carrera Panamericana. Most top-class sports car races emphasize endurance, reliability, and strategy over pure speed. Longer races usually involve complex pit strategy and regular driver changes. As a result, sports car racing is seen more as a team endeavor than an individual sport, with team managers such as John Wyatt, Tom Walkinshaw, driver-turned-constructor Henry Pescarolo, Peter Sauber and Reinhold Joest becoming almost as famous as some of their drivers. The prestige of storied marques such as Porsche, Ferrari, Jaguar, Aston Martin, Lotus, Maserati, Alfa Romeo, Lancia, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW is built in part upon success in sports car racing and the World Sports Car Championship. These makers' top road cars have often been very similar both in engineering and styling to those raced. This close association with the exotic nature of the cars serves as a useful distinction between sports car racing and touring cars. The 12 hours of Sebring, 24 hours of Daytona, and 24 hours of Le Mans were once widely considered the trifecta of sports car racing. Driver Ken Miles would have been the only ever to win all three in the same year but for an error in the Ford GT40's team orders at Le Mans in 1966, that cost him the win in spite of finishing first. History. Evolution. In the 1920s, the cars used in endurance racing and Grand Prix were still basically identical, with fenders and two seats. To carry a mechanic if necessarily permitted, cars such as the Bugatti Type 35 were almost equally at home in Grand Prix and endurance events. But specialization gradually started to differentiate the sports racer from the Grand Prix car. The legendary Alfa Romeo Tipo A monoposto started the evolution of the true single-seater in the early 1930s. The Grand Prix racer and its miniature, Voiturette offspring rapidly evolved into high-performance single-seaters optimized for relatively short races, by dropping fenders and the second seat. During the later 1930s, French constructors, unable to keep up with the progress of the Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union cars in GP racing, withdrew into primarily domestic competition with large-capacity sports cars. Marques such as Delahaye, Talbot and the later Bugattis were locally prominent. Similarly, through the 1920s and 1930s the road-going sports GT car started to emerge as distinct from fast tourers and sports cars. Whether descended from primarily road-going vehicles or developed from pure-bred racing cars came to dominate races such as Le Mans and the Mille Miglia. In open-road endurance races across Europe such as the Mille Miglia, Tour de France and Targa Florio, which were often run on dusty roads, the need for fenders and a Meccanica Navigator was still there. As mainly Italian cars and racers defined the genre, the category was called Gran Turismo, as long distances had to be traveled, rather than running around on short circuits only. Reliability and some basic comfort were necessary in order to endure the task. Post-war revival. After the Second World War, sports car racing emerged as a distinct form of racing with its own classic races, and, from 1953, its own FIA-sanctioned World Championship. In the 1950s, sports car racing was regarded as almost as important as Grand Prix competition, with major marques like like Ferrari, Maserati, Jaguar and Aston Martin investing much effort in the works programs and supplying cars to customers. Sports races lost their close relationship to road-going sports cars in the 1950s, and the major races were contested by dedicated competition cars such as the Jaguar C and D types, the Mercedes 300 SLR, Maserati 300S, Aston Martin DBR1 and assorted Ferraris including the first Testarossas. Top Grand Prix drivers also competed regularly in sports car racing. After major accidents at the 1955 24 Hours of Le Mans and the 1957 Mille Miglia, the power of sports cars was curbed with a 3-liter engine capacity limit applied to them in the World Championship from 1958. From 1962, sports cars temporarily took a backseat to GT cars, with the FIA replacing the World Championship for sports cars with the International Championship for GT manufacturers. Growth at a national level. In national rather than international racing, sports car competition in the 1950s and early 1960s tended to reflect what was locally popular, with the cars that were successful locally often influencing each nation's approach to competing on the international stage. In the USA, imported Italian, German and British cars battled local hybrids, with initially very distinct East and West Coast scenes. These gradually converged and a number of classic races and important teams emerged, including Camarade, Briggs Cunningham and so on. The US scene tended to feature small MG and Porsche cars in the smaller classes, and imported Jaguar, Maserati, Mercedes-Benz, Allard and Ferrari cars in the larger classes. A breed of powerful hybrids appeared in the 50s and 60s and raced on both sides of the Atlantic, featuring European chassis and large American engines, from the early Allard cars via hybrids such as Lotus 19s fitted with large engines through to the AC Cobra. The combination of mostly British chassis and American V8 engines gave rise to the popular and spectacular Can-Am series in the 1960s and 1970s. In Britain, 2-litre sports cars were initially popular. Subsequently, 1100cc sports races became a very popular category for young drivers, with Lola, Lotus, Cooper and others being very competitive. Although at the other end of the scale in the early to mid-1960s, the national sports racing scene also attracted sophisticated GTs and later a crop of large-engined big bangers, the technology of which largely gave rise to Can-Am but soon died out. Clubmans provided much entertainment at club racing level from the 1960s into the 1990s, and John Webb revived interest in big sports prototypes with Thunder Sports in the 1980s. There was even enough interest in Group C to sustain a C2 championship for a few years. At club level, modified sports car and production sports car races remained a feature of most British race meetings into the 1980s, evolving into a special GT series that was essentially Formula Libre for sports or saloon cars. After a relative period of decline in the 1980s, a British GT championship emerged in the mid-90s. Italy found itself with both grassroots racing with a plethora of Fiat-based specials and small Alfa Romeos, and exotica such as Maserati and Ferrari, who also sold cars to domestic customers as well as racing on the world stage. Road races such as the Mille Miglia included everything from stock touring cars to world championship contenders. The Mille Miglia was the largest sporting event in Italy until a fatal accident caused its demise in 1957. The Targa Florio, another tough road race, remained part of the World Championship until the 1970s and remained as a local race for many years afterwards, as the French car industry switched from making large powerful cars to small utilitarian ones. French sports cars of the 1950s and early 1960s tended to be small capacity and highly aerodynamic, aimed at winning the index of performance at Le Mans and Reims and triumphing in handicap races. Between the late 1960s and late 1970s, Matra and Renault made significant and successful efforts to win at Le Mans. In Germany, domestic production-based racing was largely dominated by BMW, Porsche and Mercedes-Benz, although sports car GT racing gradually became eclipsed by touring cars, and the initially sports car-based Deutsche Rennsportmeisterschaft gradually evolved into the Deutsche Tourenwagenmeisterschaft. Porsche started to evolve a line of sports prototypes from the late 1950s, noted for the toughness and reliability. They started to win in races of attrition such as the Targa Florio, and as they grew bigger, the Stuttgart Mark became first competitor for overall wins and then came to dominate sports car racing. Both they and Mercedes have made intermittent returns to the top level of the sport through the 1970s, 80s and 90s. Sports car racing has intermittently been popular in Japan. In the 1960s, small capacity sports races and even a local version of the Group 7 cars, as raced in Can-Am, were popular. A healthy local sports prototype championship ran until the early 1990s, and now the Super GT series provides high-budget exposure to manufacturers, with many international drivers appearing. The Japanese manufacturers have also been frequent visitors to the US sports car scene and to the European scene, in particular Le Mans, where despite many years of trying by all the main Japanese marques, the only victory to have been scored by a Japanese marque was by Mazda in 1991. 1960s and 1970s, evolution, rise, and decline. Powerful prototypes started to appear as the 1960s progressed, with worldwide battles between Ferrari, Ford, Porsche, Lotus, Alfa Romeo and Matra, as well as other more specialist marques running on into the early 1970s. The competition at Le Mans even made it to the movie screens, with Steve McQueen's film Le Mans. This era was seen by many as the high point of sports car racing, with the technology and performance of the cars comfortably in excess of what was seen in Formula One. Homologation saw many out-and-out racing cars produced in sufficient quantities to see them classed as production vehicles. The FIA responded by placing more restrictions on even the allegedly production-based cars and placed draconian limits on the power available to prototypes. These prototypes of the late 1960s, early 1970s were comfortably quicker than contemporary Grand Prix machinery, and for 1972 they were constrained to run much smaller engines to F1 rules, often detuned for endurance. Group 4 Grand Touring cars and Group 5 special production cars became the premier form of sports car racing from 1976, with prototypes going into a general decline apart from Porsche 936 domination at Le Mans and a low-key series of races for smaller 2-liter, Group 6 prototypes. A peculiarly American form of sports car racing was the Can-Am series, in which virtually unlimited sports prototypes competed in relatively short races. This series ran from 1966 to 1974 and was an expansion of the USRC that conformed to FIA Group 7 rules. The original Can-Am fell victim to rising costs and the energy crisis. The ACO organizers of the Le Mans 24 Hours attempted to come up with a formula that would encourage more prototypes back to the race but would also be relatively economical example, the Grand Touring prototype rules in the late 1970s, based on fuel consumption rules, gave rise to two different varieties of sports car racing that were widely held to be a high point in the history of the sport. 1980s, Group C in IMSA GTP. In Europe, the FIA adopted the ACO GTP rules virtually unchanged and sanctioned the Group C World Endurance Championship, featuring high-tech closed-cockpit prototypes from Porsche, Aston Martin, Mercedes-Benz, Nissan, Jaguar and others. In the USA, the IMSA Camel GTP series boasted close competition between huge fields of manufacturer-backed teams and privateer squads. The cars were technically similar to Group C's but used a sliding scale of weights and engine capacities to try to limit performance. Both Group C and GTP had secondary categories, respectively Group C2 and Camel Lights for less powerful cars, targeting entries by small specialist constructors of serious amateur teams. The FIA attempted to make Group C into a virtual two-seater Grand Prix format in the early 1990s, with engine rules in common with F1, short race distances, and a schedule dovetailing with that of the F1 rounds. This drove up costs and drove away entrants and crowds, and by 1993 prototype racing was dead in Europe, with the Peugeot, Jaguar, Toyota and Mercedes-Benz teams all having withdrawn. 1990s, rebirth and revival. In an attempt to provide a top-class endurance racing series to replace the WSPC, a number of GT series sprung up at national and European level, with the BPR series eventually evolving into the FIA GT Championship. IMSA GTP continued for a few more years but was replaced by a series for world sports cars, relatively simple open-top prototypes which gave rise to cars such as the Ferrari 333 SP and the Riley and Amp Scott MK3, supported by GTs. As the 1990s progressed, these prototypes and others like them started to be raced in Europe, and an FIA sports car series evolved for them. Since the demise of Group C, Japan has largely gone its own way in sports car racing. The Super GT series is for very highly modified, production-based cars, although prototypes are slowly returning to Japanese racing in the Japan Le Mans Challenge. Many of these prototypes are little more than rebodied Formula 3 cars. In the US, however, road racing actually saw a decline. The IMSA GT Championship had been prototype-based since 1983, with less emphasis on production cars. NASCAR was becoming increasingly dominant, and the IndyCar series split from CART in 1996 put more emphasis on ovals regarding domestic open-wheel racing. Also contributing to the decline was the retirement of Mario Andretti from Formula One. It would be over a decade before another American driver would join Formula One, viz. Scott Speed, although Speed was ultimately unsuccessful and eventually joined NASCAR himself. 2000's resurgence in the US. The debut of the Speed Vision television network brought a resurgence of interest in sports car racing in the US, with the network originally showing a large amount of sports car racing and sports car-related programming before being replaced by Fox Sports. The IMSA GT series evolved into the American Le Mans series. The European races eventually became the closely related Le Mans series, both of which mix prototypes and GTs. The FIA remains more interested in its own GT and GT3 championships, with the ACO's rules the basis for the LMS and ARMS. The Le Mans prototype is somewhat reminiscent of the old Can-Am prototype. Further splits in the American scene saw the Grand American Road Racing Association form a separate series, the Rolex Sports Car Series, with its own GT and prototype rules aimed at providing cheaper, lower-cost racing for independent teams. Grand Am's Continental Tire Sports Car Challenge, US support series for the Rolex series, provides a similar series to the old Trans Am series, mixing conventional sports cars and touring cars. Due to Grand Am's affiliation with NASCAR, many NASCAR drivers occasionally participate in the Rolex Sports Car Series. Max Papis is a notable example in that he was a road racer prior to his tenure in the Sprint Cup Series. Many of these drivers only participate in the 24 Hours of Daytona. The original Trans Am series dissolved in 2006, but returned to action in 2009 with tube-frame TA1 and TA2 divisions racing with production-based TA3 American and TA3 International divisions. In addition, the SCCA continues to provide a major support series for Trans Am. This series, known as the SCCA World Challenge, consists of a 1-hour race for each round, combining 3 classes: GT, GTS, and touring car. The Trans Am series returned in 2009, but has yet to establish a television contract. 2010s reformatting. The 2010s have seen a major overhaul of sports car racing in the United States. The Pirelli World Challenge reformatted in 2010 to have a showroom stock touring car group comparable to that of the Continental Challenge's Grand Sport class, promoting its other touring car class to GTS. This came after several years of the old TC class being an Acura BMW Mazda affair. For 2012, the series will be adopting a B-spec touring car class comparable to that of the Continental Challenge's Street Tuner class. Meanwhile, the Rolex Sports Car Series has overhauled its Daytona prototype class for 2012, allowing for production-based designs. Already planned is a Corvette-based prototype. The ALMS's new LMP/LMC format, however, has not held up. The prototype class is split again in 2011, with LMP1 having 3 cars and LMP2 having 1. A new GT Pro-Am class was added. Initially, this format was only to be used in endurance races but was eventually applied to all races. For 2012, only a handful of LMPs are being entered, with almost all of them being powered by Japanese manufacturers. The British manufacturer Morgan has entered the Judd-powered LMP. Aston Martin Racing, who for several years had entered an LMP, has returned to GT for 2012. The reformatted Trans Am series has remained stagnant, being heavily overshadowed by the SCCA's World Challenge, and failing to garner a television contract. A major factor in this is the fact that Trans Am's teams still use vehicles dating back to 1999. In most other series, teams tend to update the vehicles every few years or so. Other television changes include Speed Channel losing the rights to almost every series. The World Challenge was transferred to Versus, while the ARMS was transferred to an ESPN-ABC partnership. ARMS races are shown live online with a telecast the following day. For 2012, some races will be televised live. Speed, having a partnership with NASCAR, still has exclusive rights to the NASCAR-owned Grand Am series. The ARMS has now introduced GTE Pro and GTE AM for endurance races.